In this video, we're going to be looking at update statements, which allow you to update the values of data in your tables. And as with all the changes we're making in this chapter, we'll put our statements inside a transaction block that we roll back, so our changes aren't permanent. In the most basic form of the update statement, you specify the table you want to update, the column that you want to update, and the value that you want to set it to. For example, we could update the customer table, and we could set the active bool column to true. To visualize the change that this would make to the customer table, I could write a select statement now to select all the rows from the customer table, but I'll use this returning clause that I mentioned in the previous video, which will return all of the rows that got modified. Let's run this as a script. We got 599 rows returned, and the active bool column is true for all of those rows. So this update statement updated every row in the table. Typically though, you don't want to do that. Usually, you just want to update one or a couple of different rows. Rather than updating every customer, let's say we just wanted to update a specific customer, customer 33, and set their active state to true. We can now run this as a script, and we can see that now we only modified one row in the table. Only one row was returned from our returning clause, and the active bool is set to true. If we needed to update multiple columns at a time, there's two different ways that we could do that. Let's update a couple of different details now for Anna Hill. Let's change it so that her first name and last name have the correct capitalization, so only the first letter is capitalized. And let's also update her email address so that it's all lowercase. I'll use the initCap function that we've seen in several different videos now. So I'll update her first name, and I'll also update her last name to have the proper capitalization. Finally, I want to update her email address so that it's all lowercase. Running this as a script, her first name, last name, and email address have all been updated, so I was able to update multiple columns at once in a single statement. An alternative way to write the same thing is called the column list syntax, where we first list out the columns and then the values that those columns will take on. I'll clean up the formatting a little bit by pushing this onto the next row. Running this as a script, we get the same output. So the difference here is that we first specify the columns that we want to update, and then the values that those columns will take on. Both forms are equivalent. So that's the basics of updating. Now let's look at two slightly more advanced situations. First, let's say that we wanted to write an update statement with values that come from another query or table. For example, one thing that's always been a little bit strange with the database we've been working with is the payment dates don't actually match up with the rental dates. What do I mean by that? Let's have a look at a query. So we'll join the rental table and the payment table. And we'll join them on the rental ID. Let's run this query and have a look. So most of our rentals took place in 2005. And there's a couple of rentals there that took place in 2006. We've joined onto the payment table, and if we now scroll over, you'll notice though that a lot of the payment dates are in 2007. 2 years after the rental was actually made. That doesn't really make sense when you think about it. A customer will typically pay for a rental at the time they actually make the rental. So let's assume that there's been a data entry error, and we want to fix it so that the payment dates are always the same as the rental dates. And let's fix it so that for a given rental, the payment date is always the same as the rental date. So we want to update the payment table. So what we want to do now then is set the payment date to the rental date for that same rental. We can do this using essentially a correlated subquery. So we want to select the rental date from the rental table, and we want to make sure that we're selecting that rental where the rental IDs match. So for each payment, we'll set the payment date to be the value of the rental date for that same rental. And to visualize this change, let's also bring up this query inside our transaction. And I'll filter it down so that we're just viewing a couple of different columns. Okay, let's run this entire script now. So our update statement appears to have done what we wanted. Our payment date is now always set to the value of the rental date for the same rental. We were able to use a correlated subquery to update a table with values that came from another table. A second, somewhat similar scenario would be if you want to update some values in a table conditional upon what's in some other table. For example, looking at our relationship diagram, every customer has an active bool. Let's write an update statement which will update that active bool value to true if the customer has made a rental in 2006 or later. This is different from the previous query. In the previous query, our values came from another table. In this query, though, it's our condition that depends on the values in another table. So we want to update the customer table. We want to set the active bool to true. But we only want to do that for some customers. We only want to do it for the customers who made a rental in 2006 or later. So we could write that as where exists. And again, we can use a correlated subquery. Let's select any rows from the rental table where the rental date was in 2006 or later. And the customer listed in the rental table matches the current customer that we're looking at. And this time we will use the returning clause to return any updated customers. Before we run it, let's just think about this query. We want to update the customer table, and we want to set the active bool to true where there exist any rentals at all that were made by that customer in 2006. This is a correlated subquery because it references the customer table. Let's now run this as a script. The active bool has been set to true for all of these customers that were returned, and 158 customers got returned. How could we verify this was correct? Well, let's write a very simple query to check that. Let's select from the rental table where the rental date is in 2006 or later. And let's perform a count of the distinct customer IDs. So this query will return us a count of the distinct customer IDs who made a rental in 2006 or later. And we get 158, which is the same amount of customers who had their active bool set to true in our update statement. So our update statement worked.